I can still hear the scrape of my chair against the polished floor that morning. It was the only sound I made, but in a room where every breath felt loaded with history, even the smallest noise drew eyes. My sister's voice cut through it all sharp, unflinching, like a knife that had been waiting for the right place to press. "Mom, he'll never see a dime." She didn't even lower her tone. The sentence landed heavy in the air, dropping between the old oak table and the framed family photographs on the mantel. I didn't answer her. I've learned over the years that the first reaction you give away is the most expensive. From my seat, I could see the curl of her lip, that half smirk she uses when she thinks she's won before the fight has even begun. I kept my gaze steady on the will in front of me. Our mother's handwriting, neat but shaky in places, stared back at me from the cream-colored paper. There were years of memories between those ink strokes birthdays she never missed. Christmas mornings that smelled of cinnamon and pine, but now, all I could see was my sister's hand reaching to take more than what was hers. I felt my fingers close tighter on the armrest, the tendons in my hand straining against the wood. No one else noticed. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and continued reading, as if her words were just dust in the air. But I knew what she meant. It wasn't just money, it was an erasure. A declaration that the years I'd spent holding this family together counted for nothing. Outside, the light was flat and winter pale. It filtered through the frosted window like a cold sheet laid over the room, dulling the colors of everything it touched. My sister wore a fitted gray coat, silver buttons catching the faint light. She sat with one leg crossed over the other, her boot tapping a slow rhythm on the floor, the same rhythm she had when she was a teenager, and couldn't stand being told no. I remembered that girl, and I remembered every time I had told her yes instead, against my better judgment. The smell of the room took me back, a blend of old books, polished wood, and the faint citrus of my mother's favorite cleaner. It reminded me of Sundays, when I'd come over to fix a leaky faucet or repair a step on the porch. My sister was rarely around for those moments. She was too busy chasing whatever new opportunity caught her eye, leaving the rest of us to handle the pieces she dropped. The lawyer kept speaking, his voice measured and steady, as he listed assets, parcels of land, and the modest savings account our mother had built. Each mention of my name was short, almost apologetic. My sister's name, though, carried weight. There were clauses, details, guarantees. When it ended, the room exhaled. Papers shuffled, pens clicked. My sister leaned back in her chair, satisfied. I closed the folder in front of me, slid it into my leather briefcase, and stood. She was blocking the door, talking to the lawyer in a low voice. I waited. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes scanning my face for some sign of a reaction. "It's nothing personal, Len," she said, smiling like she'd just told me the weather report. "It's just, Mom thought I'd make better use of it." "Better use," I repeated, the words dry in my mouth. She patted my arm as if we were old friends, not blood. "Besides," she added, "you've done well enough on your own." I let her walk out first. Some people mistake that for courtesy. Others mistake it for weakness. I've spent my whole life letting them think whatever serves me best. The air outside was crisp enough to bite. I pulled my coat tighter, walked past the line of cars parked along the curb. Her husband's truck was there, the old white Ford, with his company logo on the side, paint starting to peel at the edges. Harrison Construction. The blue letters read, though the C had faded so much it looked more like an O. It had been my money that kept that truck running 5 years ago, when his business hit a rough patch. I'd written the check without asking for repayment, figuring family came first. Now, I knew better. I paused at the truck, ran my fingers over the flaking paint, and for the first time in the morning, I allowed myself the faintest smile. Back home, the house was quiet, except for the low hum of the furnace. I set my briefcase down on the kitchen table, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window overlooking the bare oak trees in the yard. I wasn't angry in the way most people understand anger. This wasn't fire, or shouting, or broken glass. This was the kind of anger that sharpens itself on silence. I thought of my father's words, ones he'd told me when I was a boy learning to work with wood. Measure twice, cut once, and never cut when you're shaking. I wasn't shaking. In my mind, the steps began to line up. I knew her husband's business wasn't doing well. I'd seen the signs subcontractors paid late, Equipment not replaced. Projects dragged out because they couldn't afford more hands. Debt was like rot in a beam, invisible until the weight finally made it snap. I didn't need to confront her. I didn't need to raise my voice. I needed to find the right angle, the clean cut that would bring the whole thing down without a single wasted motion. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to an old friend who owed me a favor, a man who knew the quiet corners of the local banking world better than anyone. By nightfall, I had the first piece of information I needed. Their business loan was in trouble. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to make certain lenders nervous. The kind of nervous that leads them to sell the debt for pennies on the dollar just to get it off their books. I sat in my study, the desk lamp casting a warm pool of light over the wood grain, and wrote down the numbers in a neat column. Beside them, I wrote one word: acquire. Not fight, not argue, just take. And when I was done, I'd let her be the one to explain to everyone how it happened. I didn't know yet exactly when I'd move, but I knew this much. The moment she told me I'd never see a dime, she'd given me permission to take every other kind of currency she had. Left pride, stability, reputation, and turn it into mine. The cut wouldn't be quick, but it would be clean, and she'd never hear it coming. The next morning, frost had crept up the kitchen windows, turning the glass into a blurred watercolor of the bare oaks outside. I traced one finger along the condensation, thinking about the conversation I'd had the night before. My friend, an old hand in commercial lending, had confirmed what I suspected. Harrison Construction wasn't just limping, it was bleeding out. The debts weren't catastrophic yet, but the margins were paper thin. Winter projects had slowed, payments from clients were delayed, and the interest on their equipment loans was the kind that gnawed through the bottom line month after month. I knew their lenders. Hell, I'd played cards with one of them 30 years ago when we were both younger, hungrier, and too stubborn to admit when we were losing. Back then, debt was just a number you wrote on paper. Now, it was the lever you used to move whole lives. I poured my coffee, black and slow, letting the steam warm my face. Patience was always my strongest suit. You don't sand down a table leg in a hurry if you want it to hold weight. You take your time, running the grain under your hand until it tells you what's weak. This was no different. By mid-morning, I was parked 2 blocks from their office. I didn't go in. Didn't need to. The building was small, 1 story, with peeling white paint and a hand-painted sign that looked like it had been done in a rush. A dented dumpster sat near the back fence, overflowing with scrap wood and broken drywall. A delivery truck pulled up, the driver hopping out with a clipboard. I watched as he handed it to Harrison, my brother-in-law, who came out in a worn brown jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his thinning hair. He signed, took the delivery, and I saw the faint slump in his shoulders as he turned back inside. It was the gait of a man trying to outrun something that had already caught him. I stayed in the car until the cold began to creep into my bones, then drove off, keeping my presence invisible. In these matters, distance isn't just a courtesy, it's cover. That afternoon, I made my first move. I called a man named Walter Briggs, who specialized in buying distressed debt. Walter had the patience of a saint and the morals of a fox. He didn't ask why I wanted Harrison Construction's accounts. He just told me what they were worth on the secondary market, and how soon he could get them. "I can have the notes in your hand within 60 days, he said, his voice smooth over the line. "But you'll need to be ready to move the moment they hit my desk. These things don't sit long." "I'm ready," I told him, and I was. I hung up, leaned back in my chair, and let the satisfaction settle in my chest. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was laying a foundation 1 brick at a time under a house they didn't know I was building. The days that followed passed in quiet preparation. I still visited the diner every Thursday morning, sat at my usual booth, and nodded to the regulars. I stopped by the hardware store to pick up screws and sandpaper I didn't need, chatted with the owner about the cold snap. I even sent my sister a birthday card, signing it the way I always had, Len. If she noticed anything in my tone, she didn't say. She sent back a short text, "Thanks," as if politeness were a burden she'd been forced to carry. What she didn't know was that by then, I'd already made my second move. I'd contacted 2 subcontractors I knew she and her husband relied on. They owed me small favors from years back, favors that now came due. I didn't tell them to stop working with Harrison Construction. I simply offered them steady, higher-paying work on my own property ventures. Work that would occupy their schedules for months. Harrison wouldn't notice right away. Jobs get delayed all the time in construction. But the absence of reliable hands would begin to show. Clients would get frustrated. Deadlines would slip. And in this business, reputation is worth more than concrete. One evening, a week into my quiet moves, I spotted my sister at the grocery store. She was in the produce aisle, holding a bunch of grapes up to the light, as if she were inspecting them for diamonds. She saw me before I saw her. That smile again, the same one from the lawyer's office. "Len," she said, walking over. "Haven't seen you since, well, you know." "I know," I said. My voice was steady, almost bored. She shifted her handbag on her shoulder. "I hope there's no hard feelings. It's just, Mom wanted to make sure things went to someone who could manage them. No offense, but you're retired. You don't need the headache." I glanced at the grapes in her hand. "Some headaches are worth having," I said. She tilted her head, unsure whether it was a jab or not. I didn't clarify. Let her wonder. By February, Walter had done what he promised. The debt package was ready. I met him in a corner booth at a small Italian restaurant off the highway. The leather folder he slid across the table was thick, the papers inside smelling faintly of toner and fresh ink. "Once you sign," Walter said, "you're the primary note holder. They'll owe you, not the bank. And if they miss another payment..." He let the thought hang. I signed. Slowly. Deliberately. The weight of the pen in my hand felt good, solid, balanced. Like a hammer before the first swing. I didn't go to their office right away. Owning someone's debt isn't about storming in and making demands. It's about letting the clock tick. Knowing each second brings them closer to the edge. I gave it 2 weeks. 2 weeks of quiet. 2 weeks of letting my sister think I was licking my wounds. Then I called Harrison directly. My voice was calm, polite. "I think we should meet," I said. "There's some paperwork you need to see." He hesitated, confusion leaking into his tone. "Paperwork? You'll understand when you read it," I replied. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in their small office. I arrived 5 minutes early, the frost still clinging to the grass outside. Harrison looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't wash off with sleep. I set the folder on his desk, opened it to the first page, and watched the color drain from his face as he read the header. "You own this?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang, the silence filling the room, until he finally looked up at me. "Yes," I said. "I own it." He glanced toward the door, as if my sister might walk in and rescue him. She didn't. I closed the folder, slid it back into my briefcase, and stood. "We'll talk terms next week," I said, already walking to the door. "Think about what you want to keep, and what you can afford to lose." That was the beauty of this kind of work. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to break a single law. All I had to do was wait. And waiting is something I've been good at my whole life. There's a peculiar sound a building makes when it's under strain. It isn't loud, not the crash of something breaking, but a subtle low groan. Wood fibers stretching, nails shifting in their holes. I learned to recognize it decades ago on job sites, because that sound means trouble is coming, whether you can see it or not. In the weeks after I became the note holder for Harrison Construction's debt, I heard that sound everywhere, not in the beams of a house, but in the voices of people connected to my sister and her husband. It began with a call from a subcontractor named Roy, a wiry man who had been laying tile for as long as I'd known him. We'd worked together off and on for years, and I'd thrown him steady work recently. "Len," he said, his voice muffled under the background buzz of a job site. "You didn't hear it from me, but Harrison's scrambling. He's late on 2 more payments to his suppliers. They're starting to cut his credit." I kept my tone even. "Appreciate the update, Roy. Keep your head down." He chuckled. "Don't worry. I like being on the winning side." I didn't act on the information immediately. The beauty of pressure is that it works best when applied slowly. A quick shove makes someone resist. A gradual squeeze makes them think they're losing balance all on their own. I visited the hardware store, just like always, buying a set of brass hinges I didn't need. I stood in the aisle talking to the owner about the cold weather, knowing full well that Harrison's nephew was working 2 aisles over. I made sure my voice carried just enough when I said, "Sometimes the real test is how long you can keep the lights on." The nephew glanced over, puzzled. I gave him a polite nod. and walked out. By early March, the weather had begun to turn, but not enough to bring new business to Harrison's door. Construction companies survived the winter by running lean and planning for spring. Harrison's problem was that his spring was already mortgaged to me. I scheduled our first formal meeting in a neutral location, a small law office on Main Street that I'd used for property closings. The receptionist knew me by name and offered coffee. Harrison arrived late, looking as if the coffee would have done him more good than me. He sat across from me at the polished walnut table, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Len, I'm not sure what you're trying to do here." I leaned back slightly. "I'm making sure the debt I own doesn't get any worse. That's good business." He glanced at the folder in front of me, but didn't reach for it. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, wondering whether to fight, to plead, or to wait me out. "You know we're good for it," he said finally. "I know you were good for it," I replied. But things change. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. That night, I sat in my study, the desk lamp throwing warm light over my ledger. I wasn't in a hurry to foreclose or seize assets, not yet. What I wanted was for Harrison to see my shadow in every corner of his business. So I made my next move. I contacted two of his major suppliers, men I'd done business with, long before my sister had even met Harrison. I didn't tell them to cut him off. I simply let them know, in the way that only an old hand in the trade can, that his financials were under review by his primary creditor. In this industry, those words are like a hairline crack in a foundation. People start stepping lightly. They slow shipments, tighten terms, demand deposits up front. By the end of the week, Harrison had to pay cash for materials he used to get on 30-day terms. Cash he didn't have. The first time I saw my sister after that, it was at a local charity dinner. She was wearing a deep green dress, her hair perfectly done, a diamond bracelet catching the light every time she raised her glass. She made her way to me during dessert, balancing a plate of cheesecake in one hand. "Len," she said warmly, as if the past few months had been nothing but cordial exchanges, "I hear you've been busy." "Staying occupied," I said. Her smile tightened. "I also hear you've been involved in some of our business affairs." I sipped my coffee. "I'm involved in a lot of things." She leaned in slightly. "If you think this is going to scare me, I'm not trying to scare you," I said, cutting her off gently. "Fear makes people rash. I prefer patience." The way her expression shifted just enough for me to catch it before she smoothed it over told me she understood more than she was letting on. Back at my house that night, I walked through the quiet rooms, the smell of oak from the old floorboards grounding me. I'd spent years building this place, brick by brick, nail by nail. You can't create something solid without time. Revenge is the same. It wasn't enough to own his debt. I wanted to own the air he breathed in his own office, to make every decision he took feel like it was passing through my hands first. So I waited for the right opening, and it came sooner than I expected. A week later, one of his foremen quit, a man named Cal, who had been with the company for 12 years. Cal came to see me at the diner, sliding into the booth across from me. "I'm not one to gossip," he said, stirring his coffee, "but things over there are getting tense. Harrison's snapping at everyone. The jobs are behind, and your sister's been around the office more," looking over his shoulder. I listened, nodding slowly. "You planning to go somewhere else?" Cal shrugged. "I heard you've got projects lined up." I didn't confirm or deny it, just left a 20 on the table and told him, "Good men find good work." That was the thing about cracks: once they start, they don't stop. By the end of that month, Harrison Construction had missed another payment to me. Not a big one, but enough to trigger a clause in the agreement. I drafted a polite but firm notice, delivered by certified mail. No threats, no bluster, just a reminder that as the primary creditor, I now had the right to review and approve any major financial decisions the company made. From that moment on, every check they wrote had my shadow over it. And in the quiet of my study, with the letter sent, I leaned back in my chair and let the silence wrap around me like a well-worn coat, because I knew, and now they were starting to know, that this wasn't a battle they could win with speed. It was a siege, and I had all the time in the world. The first sign of desperation isn't loud. It's not the yelling or the slammed doors; those come later, when there's no point hiding it. No, desperation begins quietly, with small compromises. You start cutting corners where you swore you never would. You take jobs you know you can't finish on time because you need the cash up front. You let a client slide on a deposit because you can't afford to lose them. By mid-April, Harrison was making those compromises. I heard it from two different people within a week. One was a supplier, who called me about a bounced check. The other was a former client, who said Harrison's crew had left a half-finished deck in their backyard for 2 months with nothing but excuses. "Len," the client said, lowering her voice, "I thought you should know. You always ran a tight ship when you were in the business. This isn't you." "It's not me anymore," I told her, but I thanked her just the same. I didn't go after him directly. That's the mistake people make when they smell weakness. They charge. Charging leaves you open. Instead, I fed the weakness. I called Walter Briggs, the man who'd helped me acquire the debt, and asked him to dig into the renewal terms for Harrison's equipment leases. Within 48 hours, Walter had an answer. Harrison's backhoe and skid steer were due for lease renewal in 3 months. With his current payment history, the lessor would likely either hike the rate or demand a full buyout. That kind of decision could sink a struggling business, and I was in a position to make sure it did. I spent the next week making quiet visits not to Harrison's office, but to the people orbiting it. Suppliers, clients, even the small-town banker who handled their day-to-day accounts. I didn't badmouth him. That's too obvious. Instead, I talked about tightening my own portfolio, about watching the market carefully, and about making sure I wasn't overexposed. The words were vague, but the effect was precise. In a town like ours, half the truth and a raised eyebrow can travel faster than any written notice. One Thursday, I stopped by the diner as usual. Cal, the foreman who'd quit Harrison's crew, was at the counter. He turned when I walked in, a grin spreading across his face. "You might want to swing by their warehouse," he said in a low voice. "Looks like they're clearing out some gear." I nodded, paid for my coffee, and drove by. He wasn't exaggerating. Through the open bay door, I saw 2 laborers loading a cement mixer into the back of a flatbed truck. Harrison was inside, leaning over a clipboard, his posture tight. I didn't stop, just drove slow enough for him to see me pass. Sometimes the sight of someone watching is more effective than anything they could say. That evening, I pulled the ledger from my desk drawer. I updated the balance owed, noting the missed payment from last month and the partial payment from this one. The numbers weren't catastrophic yet, but they were trending in one direction: mine. I picked up the phone and called Harrison. "We need to talk," I said. "I'm a little busy right now," he replied, his voice flat. "This isn't optional," I told him. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., my office." When he arrived the next morning, he looked like a man who'd slept in his truck. The shadows under his eyes were deep, and his shirt was wrinkled enough to show he hadn't cared to press it. "I didn't offer coffee." "Sit," I said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside was a proposal, my proposal for restructuring the debt. It wasn't generous. Lower monthly payments in exchange for collateral, his company vehicles, the equipment in the warehouse, and a 20% ownership stake in Harrison Construction. He stared at the paper for a long moment before looking up. "You're trying to take my business." "No," I said evenly. "I'm giving you a way to keep it." He laughed once, short and bitter. "And if I don't?" I leaned back. "Then I exercise my rights as note holder. And you won't like how that plays out." We sat there in silence, the air heavy between us. I watched his eyes flicker down to the paper again. He was weighing his pride against his survival, a calculation I knew well. Finally, he pushed the folder back. "I need time." "You've got a week," I said. That night, I took a slow walk around my property, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air smelled faintly of rain and cedar from the trees along the fence line. My father used to say that some things couldn't be rushed: not a good harvest, not a strong house, and not the fall of a man who still thinks he's standing tall. The truth was, I didn't care whether Harrison signed my terms or not. Either way, I'd win. If he signed, I'd have my foot inside his business legally. If he didn't, I'd own him outright by summer. 3 days later, I got my answer without him saying a word. I was at the post office when I overheard 2 men talking near the counter. One was a supplier I recognized. Said he was working on a big project up north. Needed materials before the deposit cleared. One of them said, "That doesn't sound smart," the other replied. "It's not. but he's desperate. I walked past them without breaking stride, but inside, I knew the game was tipping. Desperate men make desperate deals, and those deals usually come with paperwork I'd eventually see. The following week, Harrison came into my office. No appointment, no call. Just walked in, looking like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "I'll sign," he said, setting the folder on my desk. I didn't move it right away. "Sure you don't want more time?" "No," he said. "Let's get it over with." He signed, initialed each page, and slid the papers back across the desk. His hand was steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw. When it was done, I closed the folder gently. "You've made the right choice." He didn't answer, just left. That night, I poured myself a drink bourbon, neat, and sat by the window. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the branches of the old oak in the yard. I thought about my sister, about the way she'd looked across the lawyer's table the day she said I'd never see a dime. I wondered if she had any idea how close her husband's company was to no longer being his. If she didn't, she would soon. Because in the end, I wasn't just after Harrison. I was after the look on her face when she realized exactly who she'd been underestimating all these years. The papers were signed, notarized, filed clean, binding, irreversible. 20% of Harrison Construction was mine, and with it, a set of rights Harrison couldn't ignore even if he wanted to. I didn't need to be in the office every day. That would have been too obvious. Too loud. My kind of power works better like weather always present, always felt, but never in a single storm you can point to. My first move wasn't to change policy. It was to change the view. The following Monday, a new truck pulled into the company lot mine. Dark green, freshly detailed, with my name in small, sharp lettering on the driver's door. L. Whitmore, partner. No logo, no slogan. Just my name, clean and unadorned. I didn't say a word about it to Harrison. Didn't have to. I caught him glancing at it twice that morning when I came in for our first partner meeting. We met in his cramped office, where the blinds were half closed even though the morning sun was soft. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and drywall dust. "Let's talk about this quarter," I said, setting my leather folder on the desk between us. "I've reviewed the numbers. You're carrying too much idle equipment, and half your subcontractors are double booked." He shifted in his chair, clearly not used to having his operations critiqued by someone outside his inner circle. "It's a seasonal lull." "It's waste," I corrected. My tone even. And waste is the difference between staying open and shutting down. I left him with a list of recommendations, not orders. But with my ownership stake, he knew they might as well have been. By the end of the week, 2 part-time office staff were gone. The underused warehouse trailer was listed for sale, and Harrison himself was making job site visits instead of hiding behind his desk. My sister didn't call me, but I knew she'd heard. Word like that travels fast, and she was too proud to ask why the changes were happening. The second week, I started making site visits unannounced. I didn't come to shout at workers or micromanage. I came to watch. A man with a clipboard and a calm gaze can unsettle more than a man with a raised voice. On one site, a younger foreman stopped what he was doing and approached me, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Mr. Whitmore, I didn't know you were coming by." "That's the point," I said, surveying the framing. "Carry on." The work was solid, but the crew was smaller than it should have been. Another cut Harrison had made without telling me. I made a note. 2 Fridays later, I had my first board meeting with just the 2 of us. The ledger sat between us like a third participant. "You've reduced payroll by 15%, I said. "Good. But the job completion rate has slowed by 20. "Not good." Harrison rubbed the back of his neck. "We're doing what we can with what we've got." "You're doing what you think you can," I said. "The numbers say otherwise." He didn't answer. That's the thing about silence, most people can't hold it for long. But I can. I let the quiet hang until he looked away. Then I closed the ledger. "We'll revisit this next month." Outside the office, the spring air was heavy, with the smell of cut grass and diesel from a passing truck. I stood there for a moment, letting the scent settle. There's something about that mix industry and growth that tells you you're in the right place at the right time. The truck belonged to one of our major suppliers. I made a mental note to call him that evening, just to check in. a partner's privilege. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm glow on the bourbon glass in front of me. I thought back to the day in the lawyer's office, my sister's voice cutting the air like a blade. "Mom, he'll never see a dime." I was seeing more than that now. The third week, I arranged for a financial review, a formal one. Harrison wasn't happy about it, but as a part owner, I had the right to initiate audits. The accountants came in on a Tuesday, their quiet efficiency filling the office like an invisible net. They asked for receipts, invoices, payroll records. I watched Harrison's jaw tighten each time they requested a document he couldn't find. By Thursday, the preliminary report was on my desk. It wasn't disastrous, but it confirmed what I already knew: mismanaged accounts, late fees stacking like bricks, and a tendency to rob Peter to pay Paul. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. Numbers don't lie, and Harrison knew it. At the end of that week, I dropped by my sister's house. It had been months since I'd stepped inside. She opened the door with a polite smile that didn't touch her eyes. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" she asked. "I thought I'd update you," I said, stepping past her into the living room. "Your husband's business is stabilizing, slowly, but it's still under strain." She crossed her arms. "And I suppose you're the reason it's stabilizing?" "I'm a reason," I said. "The difference is, I don't gamble with what I can't afford to lose." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "If this is some way of getting back at me, it's not about you," I said softly. But my eyes didn't leave hers. "It's about the business, and making sure it doesn't end up where you said I would, with nothing." I left her house that evening with the same calm I'd walked in with. Because the truth was, I'd already started to change more than the business's bottom line. I was changing the story they told themselves about who held the power, and I wasn't even close to done. I've always believed that the fastest way to sink a captain is to make the crew stop looking at him for orders. You don't need a mutiny. You just need enough eyes turning your way when the wind changes. By the time I was 3 months into my ownership stake, I didn't have to announce myself at job sites. The crews just started talking to me. The first sign came on a Monday morning. I stopped by a renovation project on the edge of town, a 2-story house with scaffolding hugging its frame like a cage. The foreman, a young man named Kyle, was showing a set of plans to a client. When he spotted me, he excused himself and walked straight over. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "the suppliers shorted us on the lumber. Harrison told me to make do, but I figured I'd see what you think." It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the way he said "you think." I looked at the delivery slip, then at the skeletal frame of the house. "Call the supplier," I said. "Tell them to send the missing boards by tomorrow. If they give you trouble, tell them to bill it directly to me." His relief was visible. "Thanks. I'll do that." Harrison was nowhere in sight. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, it was an electrician who asked my opinion on a change order before he asked Harrison's. He tried to hide it by saying he just ran into me, but I could see the truth: he trusted my judgment more than the man who signed his checks. I didn't encourage it. I didn't have to. Authority isn't something you chase. It's something people hand you when they believe you won't drop it. The next step was structural. I called a partner review meeting and presented a set of new operating procedures. On paper, they looked harmless: a few changes to job scheduling, supply ordering, and payroll reporting. In practice, they routed all major purchase orders through my approval. Harrison read the packet slowly, flipping pages like they might bite him. "You're consolidating decision-making." "I'm streamlining," I said evenly. "The less back and forth, the faster the jobs finish." "Oh no." He didn't argue, but the way his pen dug into the paper when he signed told me exactly how he felt. By the end of the month, my phone was ringing more than his. Clients called me directly to clarify details or check in on timelines. I never discouraged it. In fact, I started carrying a small leather notebook just for those calls, jotting down notes like I'd been the one running the show all along. Harrison noticed, of course. He started showing up at job sites unannounced, trying to reassert himself. But the problem with a man who leads by proximity is that he has to be present to be relevant. He didn't. One afternoon, I stopped by the office to find Harrison in a meeting with 2 potential clients. I waited until they left, then stepped in. "You didn't tell me we had a proposal going out," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You don't need to know every detail," he replied, leaning back in his chair. When the company's credit is tied to my name, I do, I said. I slid a copy of our partnership agreement across his desk, my finger tapping the clause about financial disclosures. His jaw tightened. He glanced at the paper, then shoved it back toward me. Fine. I'll copy you next time. There won't be a next time, I said, turning for the door. From now on, you run all proposals past me before they leave this office. I knew I was squeezing him, but I wasn't reckless. If I pushed too hard, too fast, it might look like I was trying to take the business outright. My goal wasn't a hostile grab, not yet. My goal was for everyone, including Harrison, to start believing it was already mine in all but name. And that meant subtle touches. I had the trucks repainted, same company name, same logo, but with a clean, modern font and a new color scheme. Harrison grumbled about the cost, but I paid for it personally, telling him it was an investment in brand image. I started sending quarterly newsletters to clients, with both our names at the bottom, but my name came first. I sponsored a Little League team under the company's name, a team where half the parents were business owners in town. I wore my Whitmore embroidered jacket to every game. Harrison didn't come to a single one. By early summer, the shift was complete. I walked into the office one morning to find a supplier waiting with a delivery receipt. He handed it to me without hesitation. "Where do you want this?" he asked. It wasn't, "Where does Harrison want this?" It was "you." My sister must have felt the change before she heard it. She called me one Friday evening, her voice sharp. "I hear you're making a lot of decisions for my husband's business." "I'm making decisions for my business," I corrected. "It's not yours," she snapped. 20% says otherwise," I said, keeping my tone level. "And so does every client who calls me first." There was a pause, the kind where the person on the other end is trying to decide if they should hang up or keep fighting. "You think this makes you better than me?" she said finally. "No," I replied. "It makes me patient. And patience, as you're learning, is the most expensive thing you can run out of." That night, I poured myself a drink and stood at the window, watching the lights of the town flicker in the distance. The funny thing about power is that you don't have to announce you have it. You just use it, and the world adjusts. And Harrison's world was already adjusting to mine. There's a point in any siege where the defender stops thinking about victory and starts thinking about survival. You can see it in their posture, hear it in their voice. Harrison had reached that point by midsummer. It didn't happen overnight. It came through small, deliberate turns of the wrench, each one subtle enough to be dismissed on its own, but together forming a pressure he couldn't relieve. The first turn was cash flow. I called a partner meeting in June and laid out a stability plan. On paper, it was about securing our long-term growth. Advanced deposits for every job. Supplier payments moved to a strict schedule. No equipment purchases without two signatures, his and mine. He agreed, because saying no would have meant explaining why the company was running on fumes. What he didn't realize was that these rules gave me the ability to slow or approve nearly every dollar that moved through his hands. Within 3 weeks, he was waiting on me for decisions he used to make in minutes. The second turn was credit. Through a quiet conversation with the bank manager, an old fishing buddy of mine, I arranged for a routine review of Harrison Construction's credit line. The bank reduced the limit, citing operational risk. It wasn't my name on the reduction letter, but I was the reason it landed on his desk. The third turn was reputation. I didn't spread lies. I didn't have to. I just made sure I was visible in the right places: charity events, supplier luncheons, local business forums, always as Len Whitmore, partner at Harrison Construction. I spoke about our transitional phase and our new oversight structure with a calm confidence that suggested I was steering the ship. By August, more than one client had told me they were glad I'd taken a more active role. They said it in front of Harrison sometimes. That was the best part. One sweltering afternoon, I stopped by the main office. The air conditioning was working overtime, rattling faintly in the ductwork. Harrison was at his desk, sleeves rolled up, staring at a stack of unpaid invoices. "You're behind," I said, not as an accusation but as a fact. He rubbed his temple. "We're waiting on 2 big payments to clear." I set a folder down. "Or," I said, "we could liquidate the older skid steer. It's barely used. That'll cover payroll and keep the suppliers quiet." "Oh." His jaw tightened. "That machine's worth more to us in the field." "Not if it's sitting in the yard half the month," I replied. He didn't answer right away. When he finally nodded, it was the smallest movement. as if agreeing to sell the machine was admitting something larger, that I was the one making the calls now. A week later, I accompanied him to the sale yard. He handled the paperwork. I handled the handshake with the buyer. It was my name on the bill of sale. I saw him notice that too. By September, my sister couldn't ignore it any longer. She showed up at my place unannounced, standing on my porch with her arms crossed. "You're suffocating him," she said without preamble. "I'm keeping the business alive," I corrected. "You're enjoying this." I met her eyes. "You think this is about enjoyment? This is about accountability. The kind I never saw from either of you when it mattered." Her voice sharpened. "Mom would have hated this." I almost laughed. "Mom would have hated what you said in that lawyer's office. Everything since then is just the cost of doing business." She turned to leave, but I added, "And business, in case you haven't noticed, is doing better under my hand than it ever did under his." She didn't reply, just walked down the steps and drove off. The next day, Harrison missed another payment to me. That triggered the clause I'd been waiting on, the right to demand a full financial audit at any time. I called the accountant. "Pull everything," I said. "Every receipt, every contract, every account ledger for the past 3 years. The audit would take weeks, but that was fine. The waiting is what makes people sweat." By October, the picture was clear. Overextended credit, unpaid taxes from the previous year, and a pattern of robbing one project's budget to finish another. All of it legal ammunition if I needed to force a buyout. When I presented the findings in our partner meeting, I didn't raise my voice. I just laid the file on the desk, page after page, and let the silence do the talking. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice low. "What do you want, Len?" I didn't answer directly. I leaned back, folded my hands, and said, "Let's talk about ownership." That was the moment the siege stopped being a slow squeeze and started becoming an inevitability. He didn't know it yet, but the terms of his survival would be mine to write. When a man finally asks, "What do you want?" it means he's already run through every other question in his mind. He's tested every angle, every possible escape, and found the same answer waiting at each end. Harrison had reached that point. The next morning, I arrived at the office early before the crew, before the phone started ringing. The smell of coffee from the break room was still fresh, mixing with the faint scent of sawdust from a recent job. I took my time arranging the papers on the conference table. The buyout agreement was 3 pages, written in plain language, no legal flourishes. It had to read like an exit plan, not a surrender. When Harrison walked in, his shoulders were rounded forward like a man who'd been carrying weight too long. "Coffee's fresh," I said, motioning to the pot. He poured a cup but didn't sit until I gestured to the chair across from me. I slid the papers toward him. "This," I said, "is your way forward." He glanced down at the header Partnership Restructuring Agreement. I'd chosen those words carefully. Not buyout, not transfer of ownership. People will sign their name under a lot more when they think they're restructuring instead of stepping down. I leaned back, letting him read. The terms were simple. I'd purchase his remaining equity in the business at a fair market valuation. He'd remain on as a salaried project manager for 2 years with full benefits. His name would stay on the company letterhead for legacy purposes, but decision-making authority would be mine alone. All outstanding debts, including those owed to me, would be cleared upon signing. He stopped halfway through, looking up. "This makes it sound like I'm working for you." "You'd be working with me," I corrected, my voice calm. "The difference is you wouldn't be losing sleep over payroll or supplier bills. You'd be doing the part of the job you're good at, running projects, without the parts that are bleeding you dry." He sat back, the coffee cooling in his hands. "And if I say no?" I didn't smile. "Then the debt schedule continues. The audits continue. The supplier delays continue. And eventually the bank calls in your loans, and I buy what's left at auction for half this price." I let the words settle. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is the better ending." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that invites conversation. It was the kind that measures a man's pride against his survival. I didn't rush him. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the soft gurgle of the pot the only sound in the room. Finally, he picked up the pen. "I'll need my lawyer to look at it," he said. "Of course," I replied. I'd already had my own lawyer drafted airtight. His would find nothing to object to except the reality it represented. Over the next week, the papers moved back and forth between desks. Minor edits, a word here, a comma there, but the structure never changed. I kept my tone professional in every conversation, never letting him see the satisfaction beneath the surface. My sister didn't call until 3 days before the signing. "What are you doing to him, Len?" she demanded the moment I picked up. "I'm giving him a job," I said. "A good one, with a steady paycheck and no sleepless nights." "Ah, you're taking everything." "No," I said, keeping my voice low. "You took everything the day you said I'd never see a dime. I'm just making sure I never have to hear those words from you again." She hung up without another word. The signing was set for a Thursday morning at the same law office where my mother's will had been read. Walking into that building felt like closing a circle. The scent of polished wood and old paper hadn't changed. Neither had the creak in the floorboard just inside the conference room door. Harrison was already there, his lawyer beside him. Mine sat across from us, papers neatly stacked. The agreement was read aloud, clause by clause. Harrison signed each page with the slow, deliberate hand of someone carving their name into something permanent. When it was done, I signed my name under his, the ink smooth and final. The lawyer gathered the papers, clipped them together, and slid them into a folder. "That's it," he said. Harrison stood, shook my hand. His grip was firm, but I could feel the shift, not a handshake between equals, but between a man stepping aside and the one stepping in. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, the trees lining the street just starting to turn gold. I walked to my truck, the new company logo, Whitmore and Harrison Construction, freshly painted on the door. My name came first now, in bold. I didn't look back at the law office. There was no need. The siege was over. The flag was mine. The Monday after the signing, I parked in the owner's spot for the first time. No hesitation. No second glance. The air was crisp, still carrying that faint bite of early autumn, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the lot. My name, Whitmore, stared back at me from the trucks lined up in a neat row. They looked cleaner, sharper. Maybe it was the fresh paint. Maybe it was the knowledge that they were mine now, free of the quiet tug-of-war that had plagued every decision before. Inside, the office felt different. The same furniture, same beige walls, but the energy had shifted. Conversation stopped when I walked in, not out of fear, but focus. People wanted to know what the new era would look like. I called a staff meeting that morning, not in Harrison's cramped office in the open bay, where the smell of lumber and oil hung in the air. Everyone stood in a loose half-circle. Foremen, office staff, the younger laborers with dust still in their hair. "This business," I said, my voice carrying without effort, "has been built on hard work. That won't change. What will change is how we take care of the people who do that work, and the clients who trust us to do it right." I laid out my first set of changes. No more late payroll. Ever. Supplier relationships strengthened with prompt payments. Equipment upgraded where needed, not just patched to limp along. Quarterly bonuses tied to project completion rates. There was no applause. I didn't want any. I wanted nods, the quiet kind that told me they'd heard and believed. And I got them. By the second week, the pace had changed. Jobs were moving faster, cleaner. Crews started showing up early again. The break room chatter shifted from complaints about delays to arguments over which project would finish ahead of schedule. I made site visits regularly, but not to hover to be seen. There's a difference. People work differently when they know the boss is watching, because he cares, not because he's waiting to catch them slipping. One afternoon, I stood on the edge of a new housing development, watching a team set trusses against the pale sky. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud of hammers and the occasional buzz of a saw. For a moment, I felt the same satisfaction I used to when I built something with my own hands, only now I was building on a larger scale. By the end of the first month, the numbers spoke louder than I ever could. 3 projects completed ahead of schedule, 2 new contracts signed, supplier credit lines restored. It wasn't luck. It was discipline. And discipline has a way of making the right people gravitate toward you, and the wrong ones fade out. I saw my sister for the first time since the buyout at the grocery store. She was in the bakery section, picking up a cake. "I hear business is good," she said, her tone flat. "It's steady," I replied, adjusting a loaf of bread in my cart. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Better than before?" I didn't answer. I just let the question hang there between us until she looked away. The real test came in late November, when a competitor underbid us on a major renovation contract for the county courthouse. Harrison would have dropped the price to chase the win. I didn't. Instead, I called the county clerk and laid out exactly why our bid was worth the higher cost, the timeline, the quality guarantees, the proven track record. I didn't try to be charming. I was direct. A week later, the contract was ours. In December, I made one final change. The company website, which hadn't been updated in years, now featured a new banner. Whitmore Construction. Building with integrity since 1983. The Harrison name was gone. Quietly retired. I didn't send my sister a link. I didn't have to. The Friday before Christmas, the crews gathered in the warehouse for a small holiday lunch. Laughter bounced off the walls, and the smell of barbecue hung in the air. I stood off to the side, watching them. This was my company now. Solid, profitable, respected. And the woman who said I'd never see a dime, she could only watch from the outside. Revenge doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. Sometimes the loudest blow is the one delivered in silence, where everyone else notices long before the person on the receiving end admits it. By February, the company was booked 6 months out. My phone rang daily with new leads, some small remodels, others full commercial projects. I'd stopped chasing work entirely. The work came to me. The same couldn't be said for my sister. It started with whispers, the kind that drift through a town when something's changed, but no one wants to say it outright. At the Chamber of Commerce mixer, I overheard 2 women in line at the buffet. "Isn't her husband just an employee now?" one asked, keeping her voice low but not low enough. "That's what I heard. Works for Len now." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. When I left the event an hour later, my sister was at the door, her smile tight. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked. "Very much," I said, stepping past her into the cool night air. The thing about small towns is that status is as much a currency as money. My sister had spent years cultivating hers, the right charity boards, the right social circles, the right kind of small talk that implied success without needing to show it. But status wilts fast when the story changes. By spring, she'd stopped hosting the big backyard parties she used to throw. Whether it was to save face or save money, I couldn't say, but I noticed. And so did everyone else. One afternoon, I was at the bank signing paperwork for a new line of credit, this one, under the company's sole name, Whitmore Construction. As I stood at the counter, I saw her walk in. She froze for a fraction of a second when she saw me. Then, forcing a smile, she stepped up to the teller 2 windows over. "I need to transfer funds from savings to checking," she said, her voice clipped. I didn't look at her, but I heard the teller's reply. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, but your savings account doesn't have enough to cover that amount. Would you like to transfer from your joint account instead?" Her pause was long enough for me to feel it from where I stood. "No," she said finally. "That's fine. I'll take care of it later." I thanked the bank manager for his time, shook his hand, and left without a word to her. But I knew she knew I'd heard every word. Harrison himself kept his head down. He did his job, showed up on time, managed his crews, filed his reports. But there was no spark left. He was a man doing the work of survival, not ambition. I didn't push him. I didn't need to. Instead, I focused on making the company sharper, faster, more profitable. We implemented new project management software. I brought in 2 seasoned foremen I trusted from my early days. The difference was night and day. Deadlines hit without scrambling. Costs kept under control. Clients kept in the loop without chasing updates. The more smoothly things ran, the more my sister's absence from the business side became obvious to anyone paying attention. The final turn came at the annual Builders Banquet in late May. I hadn't planned on attending, but the organizing committee insisted Whitmore Construction was receiving the award for Outstanding Local Contractor of the Year. The ballroom was dressed in warm gold light. Round tables set with white linens and polished silverware. The air smelled faintly of roasted meat and red wine. When they called my name, I walked up to the stage to polite applause. The plaque was heavy in my hands, the engraved letters catching the light. Outstanding Local Contractor, Whitmore Construction. No Harrison anywhere. From the stage, I saw her sitting 2 tables back, her expression frozen between a smile and something else, something she didn't want anyone else to read. I didn't look at her again. That night, as I set the plaque on my office shelf, I thought back to that day in the lawyer's office. Her words, "Mom, he'll never see a dime," had been delivered like a closing statement. She'd been wrong. I hadn't just seen a dime. I'd seen every dollar, every contract, every ounce of respect that once orbited her name, and I'd taken it without ever raising my voice. From my window, the town lay quiet under the soft summer night. Somewhere out there, she was sitting in a house that was no longer paid for by her husband's business. She was watching her social circle shrink, watching invitations dry up, watching my trucks pass by with my name where hers used to be. And I knew she understood now: silence isn't weakness. It's the sharpest blade you can carry. The thing about revenge is that you don't win the moment the other person loses. You win when the entire room understands why. By late summer, Whitmore Construction was operating like a machine. Jobs booked solid through next spring, crews working at full capacity, profit margins tighter than they'd ever been. I didn't just have the company. I had its reputation polished to a mirror shine. It was time to make sure everyone saw it, including her. The opportunity came wrapped in an invitation. The county had approved funding for a major community center renovation, and the contract, after months of review, was ours. The kickoff would be a public event. Ribbon cutting, speeches, the works. I volunteered Whitmore Construction as the hosting sponsor, which meant my name would be on the program, the banners, the podium, everywhere. On the morning of the event, the air carried that faint promise of autumn, crisp and clean. The community center's old brick facade was draped with a fresh banner, "Community Builds with Whitmore." Below it, our crew milled about in company jackets, the deep green and silver standing out against the red brick. The trucks were parked in a neat row along the street, gleaming in the sunlight. I arrived early, walking the grounds with the project manager, making sure every detail was tight. The smell of fresh-cut grass from the adjacent park drifted on the breeze. Somewhere behind me, a local news crew set up their cameras. Half an hour before the speeches, I saw her, my sister, standing near the entrance in a navy dress, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She wasn't here for me. She was here because Harrison had been invited as lead project manager. I watched him shake hands, smile for a few photos, then glance over his shoulder toward her. His expression was careful, like he wasn't sure if she'd approve of him being here at all. When it was time for the program, the county commissioner stepped to the mic. "Today marks the start of something important," he began. "This building has stood for decades, but it needed a new chapter. Thanks to Whitmore Construction, that chapter begins now." Applause rippled through the crowd. He introduced me next. I walked to the podium, the sun warm on my shoulders, and took a moment before speaking. I could see her from where I stood, arms crossed, jaw set, the way she looked in the lawyer's office the day she thought she'd written me out of the family's future. "This project," I said, "isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about trust. When you hand someone the keys to a building that matters, you're handing them part of the community's history. Our job is to make sure that history keeps standing." I paused, scanning the crowd. Whitmore Construction is proud to take on that responsibility with a team that's built not just structures, but a reputation for doing the work right. I let that sink in, then stepped back to polite applause. Harrison came up after me to say a few words about the work ahead. He kept it short, professional. No one noticed, but I caught the shift, people clapping politely, but looking at me when they did it. It's a subtle thing, the way attention moves in a crowd. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. After the speeches, the ribbon was cut, cameras clicked, and the first phase of the project began. I made my way through the crowd, shaking hands, answering questions. When I finally crossed paths with my sister, she didn't speak right away. She just looked at the banners, the trucks, the crews in their Whitmore jackets. "You've made your point," she said at last, her voice low. I shook my head. This isn't a point. This is the business I was told I'd never be part of. And now, it's the one everyone here knows I run." Her jaw tightened. "You could have let it go." "I could have," I said. "But then we'd both still believe the lie you told that day." I walked away before she could answer, the sound of hammers and saws starting up behind me. Because this wasn't the end yet. The real ending would come when the building was finished, when the plaque on the front wall bore my name alone, and she would have to walk past it every time she came here. 6 months later, The community center stood transformed. Fresh brickwork, new windows gleaming under the morning sun, landscaping clean and deliberate. You could smell the cedar mulch before you even reached the steps. The ribbon cutting had been the opening act. This, the completion ceremony, was the final scene. I arrived early, walking the perimeter in a quiet circuit. The sound of final touch-ups, a drill here, a hammer there, faded as the crew wrapped up. I ran my fingers over the new brass plaque fixed to the front wall. Community Center Restoration. Whitmore Construction. Lead contractor, Leonard Whitmore. Owner, no Harrison. Not even in the fine print. The metal was cold under my hand, but the feeling wasn't. It was warm, steady, permanent. By the time the crowd gathered, the air was alive with the low hum of conversation and the occasional laughter of kids playing in the grass. Local reporters set up near the curb, their cameras trained on the steps. The mayor gave the opening remarks. Then the commissioner said a few words about the project's unmatched professionalism. And then it was my turn. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at faces I'd known for decades. Some were clients, some were old friends. Some, like my sister, were family in name only. This building, I said, was here when I was a boy. I came here for scout meetings, for summer programs, for the town fair when the rain forced it inside. I've seen it worn down by time, but I've also seen what happens when a community decides something is worth saving. I paused, letting the silence settle. This wasn't just a job. It was a promise that what we build, we stand behind. And when the next generation walks through these doors, they'll know someone cared enough to make it last. Guy. Applause swelled, steady and genuine. I didn't look at her. Not yet. After the ceremony, people filtered inside for a tour. I stayed on the steps, shaking hands, answering questions from the press. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her finally approach the plaque. She stood there longer than anyone else. I could see her sunglasses reflect the engraving. She reached out like she might touch it, then stopped. When she finally turned toward me, her face was unreadable. "Congratulations," she said, the word clipped short. "Thank you, I replied. "It means something coming from you." Her lips pressed into the thinnest of smiles. "You've built quite a name for yourself." "It's the same name I had the day you said I'd never see a dime," I said. "It's just easier to read now." She didn't respond, just turned and walked toward the parking lot, her heels clicking against the concrete. I watched her go, then turned back to the building. The sunlight caught the plaque again, making my name shine. Inside, laughter and conversation filled the halls, the kind of sound that tells you a place is alive again. I let it wash over me, the voices blending with the faint scent of fresh paint and polished wood. There was no speech left to give, no gavel to drop, no final letter to sign. This was the ending. The kind where nothing more needs to be said because everything that matters is already written in steel and stone. That night I locked up my office, the plaque from the builder's banquet glinting in the corner as I passed. Outside, the trucks were lined up, ready for another day's work. The war was over, and all it had cost me was patience.